So we've been talking a lot about kind of prose type content, right? And that's what people are used to in Wikipedia. It's written like an encyclopedia, and wiki journals are written in that journal style, but the journal style is of course a lot more variable, right? It might be a review article, it might be an original research article, but also all of this information is stored as prose. Wikidata is storing information as structured data. So I'll briefly introduce why you should be interested in Wikidata in general, and also how it interacts with the wiki journals. And then we'll also do a few exercises of putting data into it and reading data back out from it. And hopefully that'll give you an idea of both how easy it is to use, but also quite how wide-ranging and significant it is, particularly since I think we are getting used now to a world in which we might expect there to be some open data. So for example, when we go onto a map of the different states in the USA and what the COVID cases are for them, there's no reason why that data had to be open. It could be the case that you needed to pay every time you wanted to know what the COVID caseload was in your state or city. But it has been the case that all of that data is open. Phew. Similarly, the case for, I don't know, photographs of galaxies. It happens to be the case that NASA makes all of their images public domain. They don't even use a Creative Commons license. They put them as CC0 or public domain copyright release. But again, there's no reason why that had to be the case. It could be that every time you wanted to use the Crab Nebula, you had to pay for that, but you don't. And similarly, within my own field of genetics and genomics and structural biology, protein structures, open source. Genetic data, open source. The human genome, you want to go and view the human genome, you don't have to pay for that. But we were very close to living in a world in which you did have to pay whenever you wanted to use human genomic data. And so Wikidata is a way of exposing as much data as possible, and particularly a lot of data that is currently also proprietary. So for example, Crossref is a proprietary database. Scopus is proprietary. Google Scholar is a proprietary database which you search via a proprietary algorithm that you don't get to know in what order Google Scholar results are presented, what makes it onto the front page and what doesn't.
Which is troubling because they take advertising money.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, with a standard Google search, you also have explicitly paid promotional hits that can often be like the first 5 or 6 hits are subtly indicated as like, no, this is only a hit because they paid for it to be a hit, not because it's actually a particularly useful hit for your search terms. And so one thing to bear in mind is that the Wikimedia Foundation hosts a number of projects, of which Wikipedia is the best known, but it's only one. Wikidata is probably, I would say, going to be the most impactful over the next decade or so. But you may have already come across Wikimedia Commons, which is the image hosting platform for Creative Commons licensed images. There's Wikiversity, which is more teaching material focused content, but there's also Wikibooks for book material. There's Wikisource for hosting digitized books and source material and things like that. There's and there's a range of other platforms that are probably less impactful, like the dictionary version and things like that. But these sit within a much wider ecosystem of open knowledge that includes preprint servers, that includes open access publishers, but also includes social development organizations like UNESCO and UNICEF, or human rights and digital rights organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and creative communities and the free knowledge and knowledge steward networks, and also increasingly tech companies drawing from this. So you'll notice in the top right hand of Google Scholar searches now, you often now have this, I think Google calls it a knowledge box or something like that.
Knowledge panel.
Knowledge panel, that's the one. Often the content of that knowledge panel is drawn from Wikidata. When you ask Alexa, hey, Alexa, blah, 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 some question, that information is very often drawn straight out of Wikidata. So why deposit information into Wikidata as a database, or technically it's a knowledge base rather than a database? Well, firstly, it's this machine readable version of Wikipedia, and it's increasingly being used by AIs to understand the world as well as humans to be able to understand the world. It's ensuring that the structured knowledge that we produce is fair, so that's findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, rather than being put into walled gardens and proprietary database. It's there for the long haul. So particularly, again, within my own field, there have been so many databases that were set up at the beginning of a grant cycle, were funded for 3 years, maybe they were funded for 6 years, and then they ran out of funding and the servers went offline, and that database of antimicrobial peptides, well, it's gone. Or that database of catabolic proteins, nope, sorry, that's gone because the funding ran out, whereas Wikidata is there for the long haul. And also there's this large existing community and tools and support that you then just immediately integrate into. And similarly, in terms of drawing from information, some people are particularly interested in this from the interdisciplinary research point of view. So if I want to ask the question, tell me all of the genes that are in pathways where there is also a gene that's a known agonist for this particular pharmaceutical compound, Wikidata has that answer. Or if I want to ask something completely different, like tell me all of the pharmaceutical compounds that were discovered by women in Germany in the late 19th century, I can also ask that question from the same database. Or if I want to ask back through my academic lineage, my supervisor and their PhD supervisor and their PhD supervisor, for that entire PhD lineage, which of those people have had a scientific discovery named after them, I find out that back in my PhD lineage is Bunsen of Bunsen burner. Again, same source of information is able to answer questions from the very profound to the deeply trivial. But it's also a useful way to assign unique resource identifiers or unique object identifiers. And this is what's called the semantic web, or sometimes the URI web, where in the same way that websites have a URL and we're able to uniquely identify, if I'm talking about google.com, I mean google.com, this specific web page. And similarly, if I want to say I'm talking about this particular pharmaceutical compound, or this particular research article, or this particular clinical trial, or this particular piece of scientific equipment, I can use the same way of using a common data language, and particularly cross-links between those, in a way that is stable and also multilingual. So if I'm talking about the concept of authorship, I'm able to immediately find the concept of authorship in about 300 languages. And if I want to disambiguate that from the concept of a contributor who is a contributor to a work, but they're not an official author in the ICMJE sense of the word author, I'm able to do that in a multilingual way. And similarly, there's a as with all wikis, there's a complete transparent history for all of these Wikidata items. So whereas Wikipedia the English language Wikipedia has just reached 6 million articles, but the editor base of people supporting that peaked around 2007 and has fallen and then stabilized since then. The equivalent information for Wikidata is very different. So the Wikidata number of items recently blew through 100 million items, so already vastly bigger than Wikipedia. It's still growing extremely rapidly, and it also has a rapidly growing contributor base. And this is partly because it's multilingual. So whereas mostly people who speak English very well contribute to English language Wikipedia, the people who contribute to Wikidata, native English speakers are a distinct minority, and even people who speak English as one of their languages are not even a plurality in that sense. So there's a lot of people contributing from other language backgrounds. So just as an example, I'll give a couple of examples of Wikidata items about concepts and also about research outputs and also people and organizations and institutions. So let's keep it topical. Let's go COVID-19. Well, COVID-19 has a specific Wikidata item associated with it. All Wikidata items are just Q followed by a number. And those are related to each other by these properties, which are P followed by a number. So for example, COVID-19 has the effect of cytokine release syndrome. So the cause and the effect both have Q numbers, and the relationship between them, the relationship being the concept of an effect, has a P number. But also COVID-19 is the main subject of this particular publication. Cytokine release syndrome is the main subject of this particular clinical trial, and the clinical trial and the publication each have a Q number, and the concept of a main subject has a different P number. And again, this particular publication has an author. The relationship between the publication and the author is defined by this relationship P50. And that author has their own Q number. And similarly with that clinical trial, there's a sponsor, and we know, and we can find out the sponsor Q number, and it's also specifically looking at the research intervention of culture scene. And so again, we can see this clinical trial, its main subject, the research intervention, and the sponsors. And you can see how this is starting to be linked together into a larger network. And so again, looking at a bit more detail just at COVID-19, we're able to disambiguate between COVID-19, the syndrome, SARS-CoV-2, the causative agent, and COVID-19 pandemic, the broader socio-economic effects of widespread COVID-19 and the relationships between them. But also those sit in the middle of a way larger network where we're able to link COVID-19 to different chemical compounds via the fact that it's a drug used in the treatment of, or different clinical trials because that is the relevant research intervention, or various vaccine candidates that are a potential vaccine for. And you can see around the outside, there's all of these different classes of object that are increasingly not only interlinked with these different aspects of COVID, but of course they all interlink to one another and then vastly interlink out into different areas. So you end up with this massive single network that has, oh, this is already out of date, so I think it's 110 million items now, linked by well over 1 billion connections. And it's extremely cross-disciplinary.